So idealism is a metaphysics of experience. And the obstacle to understanding what I'm going to try and give you an idea of today, try and explain, the obstacle to understanding it is the various misunderstandings around the notion of experience that have arisen in the last 100 years, as I see it, because materialism has been the dominant metaphysics. And also in the last few decades, when the influence of materialism is beginning to wane, I think, again, these misunderstandings are prevalent. So in order to understand the kind of idealism which I will be talking about, you need to forget a bunch of things, okay? Forget the idea of experiences in bubbles coming out of your head, like in a cartoon, okay? Just for the moment, forget the idea of consciousness being a mystery which is currently being unraveled by investigation into our brain, neuroscience, etc. Forget the idea of consciousness spread around the universe in places you'd never expect, you know, electrons, etc. And most importantly, forget about the idea of idealism as making any challenge to how you see things in your ordinary everyday life, because in a way, that's the point of this kind of idealism. It doesn't challenge that, and it can't, unlike the other dominant metaphysics, such as materialism, dualism, and panpsychism, which it seems to be do continually challenge how we look at things in everyday life. The kind of idealism that I'm talking about can't do that. It's not a difficult or counterintuitive view. It's not remotely mystical. And it seems to me that once you see it, it makes an easy addition to your common sense and clears away many apparent mysteries. So I want to begin by just making a distinction, which I want you to always bear in mind, between explanation and reality. And I've got one of my holiday snaps on the screen here. This is me in Wales this year, and I'm by this ancient dolmen in Wales, built in about 3,500 BC. And I was very impressed by this, and when I got there, I thought, how did they do that? Right, it's huge. That capstone is enormous, 5 meters long. Right, how did they get it up there? So I looked on my phone, and I got an explanation. Okay, apparently they put little stones underneath and then levered it up a little bit, and then they put some more stones up and then levered it a bit more. And then when they got to the height where they could put the columns in, they took the stones away. So note that, you know, getting an explanation tells you how to do something. In a way, it takes you away from the reality, right? You're imagining these possibilities. You know, maybe I could do this with a bunch of people, or you're imagining these people in the past, right? But the reality is there straight before you, okay? And explanation quite often does this. It's a matter of telling you how to do something. You know, like somebody saw thunder and lightning, and maybe they were given the explanation, well, that's Zeus throwing his thunderbolts, okay? Or in the modern day and age, you'd be told it's to do with a rapid expansion of air next to the lightning. And of course, those kind of explanations have allowed us to do things, right? They've given us insight which allows us to create technology, etc. But nevertheless, it seems to me that what's happened now is we've become so impressed by the power of our explanations that we forget the actual reality, right? The reality is this right now. It's what you're experiencing, right? Which you understand in a certain way. Your understanding of it is the explanation. But there shouldn't be any question about what the reality is, okay? It's what you call experience.
Look at some great apes in the zoo. Gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees and bonobos. The fifth kind of great ape is the human being. The others are behind bars because we are smarter. Much smarter. At one time, we only had sticks and stones, but that was still more than the other animals had. They had only tooth and claw. Now we have intercontinental nuclear missiles. We can destroy anything we please.
She gets very enthusiastic there, yeah. I was a materialist when I started out in philosophy. I can't say I gave it an awful lot of thought. It just struck me as a sort of no-brainer. Obviously, reality is as physical science describes it, and the problem seemed to me to be created by that picture. So I did my PhD on how the brain relates to consciousness, you know, sort of standard question for analytic philosophers these days. And the reason I went into that issue is because I didn't think any of the current answers to that question from materialism made sense. I didn't doubt materialism for a second. But now I don't think any account of that is going to work, because I think it's thinking about experience in the wrong way. And what started to change my mind is to just really see the separation between something like science and metaphysics, right? There are many metaphysical interpretations of science, and materialism is an ancient one, okay? It's an ancient one that goes back to ancient Greece and also ancient India. The first materialist that we know anything about was Democritus. And right from the beginning, and when you see the spread of the influence of materialism to the current day and age, the appeal of materialism has always been its association with a certain political agenda, an anti-religious agenda. Now, I'm an atheist, okay, but nevertheless, this fact makes me suspicious about the truth of metaphysical theory. So Democritus thought that the gods don't have anything to do with us, right? They pay no attention to human beings, so religious institutions were a bit of a rip-off, right? Creating these anxieties in people as they were praying. Now, when you come to the Enlightenment in the modern era, materialism gets a new lease of life. Why? Well, the background to it seems to have been a lot of dissatisfaction with religion and religious institutions because of the religious wars that have been going on. And in the Enlightenment, there's kind of a manifesto for building heaven on earth rather than waiting for God to give us heaven, okay? Let's use science and technology to create a better world. Well, in a sense, that's what happened. We saw, in the 20th century, we saw a technological explosion, which has, massively changed the number of people in the world, the standard of life that people have. And I think that people have falsely assumed that this vindicated an ancient metaphysical interpretation of science. I don't think it does anything of the sort. It seems to me that any decent metaphysical account ought to be compatible with what contemporary science is saying at the moment. And if you actually look at and I think materialist philosophy, which has become a kind of background theme that people don't even recognize as philosophy and mistake as if it's the same thing as science, has had a huge influence on the world. I mean, you could see the standoff between communism and capitalism in the 20th century as a disagreement about how to extract the atoms from our environment and put them back together to, give us all a good standard of life. So those are the kind of, essentially, if you're talking about the metaphysics, irrational reasons that I think it is come to be dominant, basically forgetting what philosophy is and forgetting, and thinking it's the same thing as science and technology. If you actually look at what a materialist has to say in order to persuade other philosophers of their view, well, right from the beginning of the materialist renaissance in the 1950s, it focused on conscious experience, because there's something very odd about saying that an experience or a pain or a thought can be something physical, right? How can it have a size and a shape, right? It doesn't seem to make sense, right? An experience is there just for me, whereas an object is out there in the world. And the way that materialists tried to deal with this issue is, any materialist must ultimately identify experiences, no matter how much technical apparatus they put around it. If everything is physical, then ultimately experiences and thoughts must be physical as well. So there must be some kind of identity. And they went straight for that particular way of looking at it to start with. But so how can there be an identity between two things which seem to have different properties, right? Well, what they say is it's really just two interpretations, right? So just like you can interpret something as a statue or a lump of clay, you're interpreting it as a brain state or as an experience. Well, there's two problems with that, reasons it won't work. One, the idea of interpreting presupposes consciousness, right? A rock or a chair doesn't interpret anything. So you can't lean on the notion of consciousness to explain how consciousness can be something physical. Even if you think you can get around that, okay, the bigger problem is one of those interpretations must be wrong. It must be incorrect, right? Because the correct interpretation is as a brain state, okay? If I interpret that as both a screen and a cat, okay, which seem very different, then the cat, which I'm imagining, doesn't really exist. So this led many philosophers to deny the existence of experience or say that it's a kind of illusion. The evidence is illusory in some sense. But the problem with that is if experience is illusory in some way, okay, we shouldn't trust it, it's a misconception of physical reality, then, well, our whole worldview is built on this misinterpretation, right? The whole world of science. So there's no reason to believe materialism in the first place. And amazingly, Democritus, back in ancient Greece, was aware of this problem. He kind of split his mind into his thought and his sensation. And he says, "Poor thought, do you take your warrant from us and then overthrow us? Our overthrow is your fall." He thought that materialism led to a kind of skepticism. Well, as I've been trying to suggest to you, I think that technological success did most of the work in making materialism a force in our world. Within academic philosophy, it was mainly by arguing against dualism, a kind of misrepresentation of dualism. Okay, so the dualist view would be that reality is sort of split between the physical world and the experiential and conscious world. In some way they interact. More recently, there's been a resurgence of panpsychism, which is actually a very ancient view in which, in some sense, everything is conscious, or, consciousness is to be found in fundamental physical reality. Now, people have problems with both of these because they seem to have counterintuitive consequences. I'm not going to talk about them in detail because I think they're a good illustration of...
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.